So to offer a little bit of that historical social context, I want to point out to just some significant dates that I'll mention through. So across the United States, especially in the Southwest, Chicana, Chicanos, Chicanx peoples were working together to increase social political involvement during the 1960s and 70s. And so they were formulating in different spaces, so in more localized spaces, we're formulating plans to address specific needs and challenges. Commonly, a thread that we can find is that they were promoting multi-layered movements across different spaces that were focused on community response, community building. And so Chicano leaders, Chicana leaders, Chicanx leaders were articulating community resistance, cultural knowledge, and history. So one instance of that, pointing to, in early 1962, the National Farm Workers Association hosted their first official meeting dedicated to discussing labor inequities by experienced by field workers in Central Valley of California. And this wasn't happening in isolation. There was also a lot of this happening, like organizing happening in Texas too. So there's a lot of, solidarities across state borders as well. And so by 1964, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, among others, created a union providing services such as immigration counseling, voter registration to over 1,000 families. And so in December of 1965, they organized what we all know as the Great Boycott. And the protest was to challenge wage inequities as well as harmful conditions. These are not disconnected from continuous challenges that are taking place even now. And so the slogan that was used was "Help farm workers, do not buy grapes." And so south of the farm workers, in East Los Angeles, students were organizing around issues of educational injustices and seeking redress against historical cultural erasures. In March of 1968, many local high schools in the East Los Angeles, Northeast Los Angeles area, including the high school I went to, I'm so proud of that, Woodrow Wilson High School, Lincoln Heights, Roosevelt High School, they created what is the Young Chicanos, what is known as the Young Chicanos for Community Action Group, and led the walkouts. So the walkouts were challenging the erasures of Mexican American communities and histories, knowledges from the curriculum where a large portion of the students were Mexican American. So they were calling for education that also reflected the dynamics and the demographics of the population, like histories that they can point to as well. That protest, that lasted several days, and they were seeking curriculum changes. They were seeking fair and equal educational opportunities, and not just for them as students, but also for faculty and staff. In university settings, we had the growth of organizations like MECHA, which is the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, and UMAS, the United Mexican American Studies Organization. In 1968, we also see across the US, in California, Texas, and Denver, there were groups that were continuing to mobilize against the Vietnam War. And so in August of 1970, we see the National Chicano Moratorium held, which was an anti-war protest or demonstration that was attending to the high rates of Mexican-American soldiers who were dying in comparison to many other racial social groups. And so the third rally, that was this one here, there were about 20 to 30,000 people in attendance. Different numbers track the number of people that attended, but ultimately the demonstration turned into a riot, and many protesters were injured, and the death of Rubén Salazar, a Mexican-American journalist for the Los Angeles Times, occurred during that demonstration turned riot. And that was a huge loss for the Chicano community and the Mexican-American community. He was a big figure because he also promoted and spoke for largely ignored populations, like I mentioned, Mexican-American Chicano communities. And so these times are just some of the instances that we also see pushing us to a plan called El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán, the spiritual plan of Aztlán. And this was aimed at all levels of society. It focused on how artists could take up a call. Well, they didn't only focus, but one of the foci was how could artists take up a call to, quote unquote, arm themselves with spray cans, pens, their voices, paintbrushes, and engage in social issues through murals, graphic prints, performance arts, and alt art. So there was a big boom also pushing from this time period in aesthetic practices. And so these are some of the ways that we see 1960s, 1970s influencing also as it carries into the 1980s, 1990s, what art historian Jennifer Gonzalez refers to as a rejection of classist and racist frameworks and practices that were reinforced in mainstream art studies. So in 1990 to 1993, we see what's called CARA, the Chicana Art Resistance and Affirmation Program. So this exhibit gained, it was the first touring exhibit across the United States for Chicano art. And it gained a lot of momentum, a lot of attention, working with a lot of collaborations with major US museums, as well as like fellowship opportunities and programs of the sort. And Alicia Gaspar de Alba explains, culturally, Gara engaged in the critical debates and struggles of a postmodern society, particularly those focusing on the tensions between identity/difference, margin/center, subjectivity/representation, high/low culture, insider/outsider. Politically, Gara countered the aesthetic traditions of the mainstream art world, challenging institutional structures of exclusion, ethnocentrism, and homogenization. And so, alongside with this, and as my presentation hopes to show, is that there were also many generative dimensions to it that were related to the resistant, the countering, right? So the affirmative dimensions as well. And I think that we can see more of these in two of the foundational aesthetic theories that I look at, Rasquache and Rasquache Domesticana. So Rasquache, this is one image that you see on the right, kind of if you looked it up in Google, you'll see many similar types, which is an art piece on the hood of a car. And for Tomás Ybarra-Frausto, the writer and theorist of Rasquache, he talks to us about Rasquache being a shared barrio sensibility. It's from within the community. Now, it's interesting because Rasquache, it was actually, it's a word that's meant to describe something as low value. It's meant to be derogatory. So if you're calling someone, outside of this context, if you're calling someone Rasquache, you're saying that they're kind of cheap. And not just like in terms of spending, but like their quality. Their quality is low value. And it's low class. So for Ybarra-Frausto, and as Chicanx theorists were taking this up, it was meant to be an aesthetic expression of you make do with what's at hand. You make do with what's at hand from within the community, right? From this like place. It's a very place, localized sense. And the sensibility is a barrio sensibility, right? A neighborhood, community sort of sensibility. So the working class, people of color neighborhood, usually in this case at least the Spanish-speaking peoples, concerned with the everyday. As an everyday expression, it's a fluid relationality in which something like a walk through the barrio allows for a play between how the object, quote unquote, is captivating you and how you are imagining with the object. So a beaten up car might seem and be treated as junk or useless from a dominant utilitarian lens. For the Chicanx Rasquache, however, It's engaging with the car, an experience in which you're open and you see also as yourself and the object as engaging this aesthetic as a vessel that could display Our Lady of Guadalupe on the hood. And so likewise, attire is not a thing with closed opportunity or possibilities. It could be a swing. It could be a planter holding colorful marigolds that you're inviting bees, butterflies, and the spirits of the dead. So I don't know if any of you have seen it before, but I know at our home in Mexico, we had colorful tires, and they were placed in the ground, and then around them you have a bunch of flowers and plants. And so it's part of the sensibility where it's not a tire that's only used for a vehicle, right? There's an openness to it. There's possibilities. So those possibilities make it so that you're attentive. Your senses are open. You're attuned to the various dimensions and levels. So it's making beauty out of the ordinary, the everyday. Rasquache entails a collective sensibility in its social context and the environment with which spurs a co-creative process, unrestrained by rigid boundaries and social norms. The aesthetic features of such a concrete aesthetic concerned with the everyday involve an artist embedded in their everyday, not operating from the center or the margins, just simply operating from these spaces that are, of course, marginalized, but of the community, of the localized. So it's a community expression, community history, lived and generative social experience. It's filled with emancipatory gestures. And those emancipatory gestures are rooted in the ephemeral and social aspects of the aesthetic expression. So in particular, the temporal dimensions of Rasquache are those emphasized with short-lived moments that do not conform to a permanent sense of materiality, or at least not alone. It's a lived strategy that thinks of the here today, gone tomorrow. And so appealing to an ephemeral relationality deepens the possibilities for substantial relations across multiple social contexts with both physically present and non-physically present beings. And for colonized peoples operating outside of or resisting dominant logics and norms, the Rasquache sensibility is vital for maintaining connectivity despite the insecurity of everyday lives and relations. Building from and building with Rasquache is Amalia Mesa-Bains. She develops her conceptualization of Rasquache Domesticana. And this approach is a social, political everydayness of the Chicana feminine experience, and namely women's restrictions to the home, the domestic sphere, or the barrio. And in these gendered women's spaces, Mesa-Bains asserts the Domesticana engages the tensions that support subverting messages of inferiority and creating an affirmative representation of self through a collective familial world. This is to say that relationships between older generations of women, such as mothers, aunts, and grandmothers, teaching younger generations of women culinary techniques and healing knowledges of herbal concoctions and limpias, for example, or cleanses, for example, empowers the Domesticana through an expansive shared cultural and knowledge production. The Domesticana enacts an epistemological and ontological sense, actively open to simultaneously resisting the colonial structures of patriarchy and affirming an interconnected social relationality. So these dual processes are here what we see with Mesa-Bains describing as cherished moments standing side by side with examinations of self, culture, and history in visions of a domestic chamber that is both paradise and prison. The juxtaposition of paradise and prison allude to the ways in which women in domestic spaces can nourish relations with others who are similarly subjugated by cultural and colonial divisions of gender roles. The contradictory dynamics help contextualize the local spaces in which Chicanas are responding from, that is often the domestic sphere, and reveal the emancipatory possibilities that exist in these sorts of practices. And I'll return to that a bit more with the discussion on altar aesthetics and the practices there. But to point back to Rasquache and Rasquache Domesticana, they're both aesthetic sensibilities in which we can address them from specific people spaces, those that are of the margins of society. And they inform a concrete social and politically situated aesthetic that enacts their outsiderness through communal relations with other oppressed peoples. And so it's a collective positionality that is socially and epistemologically embedded in multiple traditions, cultures, and histories, or worlds of sense. And as a resistant modality, it invokes a social interrelated sense to recognize recreative communal relations that enliven resistance, such as those between the living and the dead. So pointing to some of that here, this is one of Amalia Mesa-Bains' altar installations. And so she has here Dolores del Rio. She was a Hollywood movie star and of Mexican descent. And so Mesa-Bains builds this altar for her, but also makes it part of what the lineage is she's identifying herself as part of. So those women that are also excluded or neglected in their own practices, in their own like artwork and their own contributions. So Amalia Mesa-Bains is identifying herself as part of these lineages and in more ways as we see carry on in the presentation. But it's an altar installation and one that is maintaining the ephemeral and collective practice of art making to bolster resistance to the dominant social exclusions. And just to also point out too, like the items that she uses are just pretty much casual, ordinary items, but she's putting them together. It's an assemblage of aesthetic practice of these ways in which they come together to bring forward this beautiful altar. Now, thinking of the altar and the altar spaces, pointing to altars as visible mediating spaces. Right? There's a materiality to the altar, not only materiality, but there is a materiality to it. And so there as a visible mediating space between these types of dichotomies that are typically upheld in dominant logics, or let's say, like if we're focusing again here in the US with the Chicanx circumstances, the dichotomies of the subject and the object, of the public and the private, the visible and the invisible, individual and communal, and the living and the dead. Now, altar practices and altars, they have long histories in the Americas, the Caribbean, and West Africa, among other regions. The traditions are, so the spaces, they're engaging a dynamic relation with the living and the dead. And so in the altar space, you might attend to your spirit guides, your spiritual community. You might take up cultural meanings and cultural shifts. And in doing so, also providing sustenance for your ancestors. Chicanx people take up altar practices with roots and practices informed by these traditions that I've mentioned. And generally in the altar creation practice, you erect an altar, the altarist blesses the space. That might be done by sweeping and or cleansing with like palo santo or sage, or like it could be done with chamomile. So the herbs and the items to cleanse with might vary depending on the tradition and the practice, but you purify that space, you cleanse the space. And blessing that space for the Chicanx or for anyone building the altarist, you choose the images, the figurines, the foods, the water, the candles, and any other items that you also intend to be offerings to your ancestors or your ancestral community. And the ritual of altar making calls the altarist to engage a reciprocal relation with the dead that simultaneously is disrupting the norms, those dichotomies that are operating. In particular, they enact a sensibility of the spiritual in the everyday, and in doing so, they are interrupting how we can otherwise conceive and practice our relations here. So, as I mentioned, the altar being a visible meeting space, but it also holds these invisible entities, right? That's part of what the meaning is in that practice. So altar aesthetics taken up through Amalia Mesa-Bains, Ofelia Esparza, Consuelo Flores, and other Chicana artists, they hold a space to critically engage a cross-cultural consciousness that reframes socialities. For instance, on the altar, the Domesticana maintains a communal and ephemeral spirituality that resists hierarchical gender norms and the violence of colonial modern social impositions that again, the Chicanx culture is contesting largely Catholic colonial conversion. As a Rasquache aesthetic, the process involves communal relationality, invokes a multidimensional sensibility and capable of mediating oppositional forces, while holding spaces with others across realities and temporalities. So just to show kind of what it references to here, it's Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. That's who Amalia Mesa-Bains has built the desk altar for. And across temporalities, referencing like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz was not of the same time frame as Amalia Mesa-Bains. Very different centuries, in fact. But it's meant to, the way that she's taking it up is meant to draw these relationalities across those temporalities as well. So she enacts, Amalia Mesa-Bains is her altar installations are creating a third space that invoke and sustain those types of possibilities. Rivera and Havaschke often offer insights of a third space as one in which, quote, these relations, elements interweave with one another without losing themselves, thus creating a third expansive where cosmic reciprocities transpire, end quote. And so the third space in the Chicana altar aesthetics holds the interconnected relation across difference, including cultural, gendered, religious, and political. And in her altar installations, she's enacting the Domesticana to hold an ephemeral site of memory in which the feminine is repositioned as enacting techniques of subversion among women's spaces. These techniques that play with traditional images and cultural material, the artist engages a sensibility that weaves multi-layered expressions of gender, sexuality, power, and identity across histories and traditions from an emancipatory position. So playfulness enacts a subversion process of rehistorization that refuses the inferior attributes assigned to women across generations. Mesa-Bains explains that some Chicana artists retrieve what is considered past due to destabilize the wounds of patriarchy and colonization by bringing forward the ephemeral and temporal dimensions of defiance art. And so getting here to this quote, Lara Y. Perez, who writes on altar aesthetics, she references, or she analyzes a bit of the altar installations by Amalia Mesa-Bains. And so she references the desk, and she says, Sor Juana's desk or laboratory, through a make-do with what's at hand politics of her own, symbolized the rejection of what was intended for a woman in patriarchal, viceregal New Spain. And so, how many of you all know who Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is? Okay, a few of us, a little bit at least. She was a nun during colonial Mexico, under Spanish control. And She had very limited options at the time before she chose her path, her vocation. For women, there were very few options at that time. Needless to say, she chose to be a nun, where she can continue her studies, to continue her spiritual commitment to her religion, but also her intellectual development and her advancement. One that was not typically allotted to women outside of that vocation. And so the desk was a very important space for her to do that. She wrote many letters challenging religious authorities on the place that they said where women ought to be and the role that women carried in history. And so the types of erasures that were being committed against women of the time, she was speaking out against with a pseudonym, but nonetheless, she was still very vocal about that. And so the desk, Amalia Mesa-Bains envisioning Sor Juana's desk as that place where she could do her resistance, where she could connect herself with other women. And again, like the Dolores del Rio altar installation, Amalia Mesa-Bains is identifying herself as part of these lineages. And so she calls Sor Juana, and many do often reference her as maybe one of the first feminists that we can identify of the Americas. And Mesa-Bains actually even goes a little further and says she's probably one of the first Chicana feminists, even though Sor Juana was Spanish, right? And so that goes back into the ways that this practice of sensibility is trying to build across religions, ethnicities, temporal stages, and identify that type of resistant relationality, right? So a subversion happening here, but then also an affirmation, right? A sustenance of sorts. So she has those types of items that you would typically find the ordinary desk might have. Oh, I'm jumping actually a little bit ahead here. So Mesa-Bains' altar installations, they expand the use of the home altar to public social spaces like communities, workshops, and museums. There's a dichotomous subversion happening there even between the public and the private. Her work continues the altar tradition of the earlier stages of the Chicanx art movement that promoted aesthetic resistance and community solidarities. Recently, public altar art is commonly seen in the United States due to the Day of the Dead celebrations, as we were mentioning earlier. So the November 1st and 2nd holiday have been popularized in part because of the vibrant colors, the beautiful artistic displays, and the creative representations of death that mark the commemorations. Sometimes even often referred to as the Mexican Halloween, not the Mexican Halloween. I think my heart just skipped a beat on saying that. But the way to try to understand the Day of the Dead celebrations in these ways. And so in recent years, mainstream culture has embraced the Day of the Dead celebrations. I don't know how common you might see them at grocery stores, but I know at our grocery store in Texas, H-E-B, the grocery store of Texas, there's all sorts of Day of the Dead things. Dollar Tree, all sorts of 99-cent store. Yeah, it's everywhere now. It's easily accessible. And so, of course, Coco being one of those films that really pushed it, helped push the Latinx holiday to commercial market rapidly. So you can find those beautiful, colorful skulls. You can get your face painted to match the skulls on the Coco. I don't know if you all know this, Disney tried to, I think, trademark Day of the Dead, because that's what Disney does. And they were largely unsuccessful because of a lot of the pushback they got. But some of that, of course, isn't largely shared. And also what's not largely shared, as we are seeing more Day of the Dead celebrations happening, is the longer history of Day of the Dead celebrations in the US and the role that Chicanx artists and communities have offered to help continue these practices in the US. And so I'm hoping that we can also see how that in these very localized spaces are offering a lot of insights into the ways we can think about even the commercialization of Day of the Dead celebrations. Now we are here. These are some posters, they're print graphics, for Day of the Dead celebrations that are created by self-help graphics artists. So these are just like 1970s, and then that was one of the more recent ones in 2019. Just different, each year an artist is picked and they create the main images. So the first public Day of the Dead celebrations were hosted by self-help graphics and art alongside Plaza de la Raza in 1973. So Plaza de la Raza is, Galeria de la Raza is a museum, local museum in San Francisco. And self-help graphics is in Boyle Heights, East LA area. I'm focusing on self-help graphics, but I'm also curious, and as I continue this investigation, like what the connections are between the two celebrations that were happening, but seemingly weren't connected at the time. So that's something that I hope to continue to explore, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'll focus on the Boyle Heights community. So the Day of the Dead celebrations were centered on meaning making and community building in a time where a lot of social contestations were taking place in both cultural and spiritual form. The self-help graphic event was a small community affair. It did include some face painting and altar making, but it involved a procession from the local Evergreen Cemetery through the streets of East Los Angeles to the parking lot behind self-help graphics on Brooklyn Avenue and Gage Street. Various participants also had like white skull face painting. They thought that would be a really good way to take on the practice, even though that wasn't something that was typically associated with the traditional ways that they understood it from Mexico. And the altar and the cemetery processions, which presumably were Catholic in nature, were not pronounced as such. So they weren't articulating, at least intentionally, the Catholic dimensions of what like the cemetery, for example, or the altar making was related to here. And so they focus on a community spiritual articulation that was a form of connecting with the souls of their lost ones while rejecting the colonialist enunciations of religion. And for some, the participants were not even churched, as they referred themselves. And Medina and Cadena explained that though they weren't church, many continued to identify with the symbols that represent the faith, the courage, and the survival of their Catholic parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, as Catholicism was not something they necessarily chose earlier to have done. So Dia de los Muertos celebrations reflected an emphasis on maintaining relationality, continuity, and spirituality. The acting cultural carriers were Carlos Bueno and Antonio Ibanez, along with Sister Karen Bocalero, and many local East Los Angeles artists taking on the practices of Mexican celebrations of Days of the Dead to generate a response to multifaceted hostility and discrimination, varying from the Vietnam War, police brutality, intercommunal gang violence as well. And so it wasn't a trivial or wholesomely joyous process. It wasn't, especially given the intra and intercommunal harms that the members were experiencing. So one of the artists, Henry Gamboa Jr., he describes some of these conditions of the Chicanx artists and the community that they faced when they first decided they wanted to establish Day of the Dead celebrations that year. The streets of East Los Angeles were the battleground of a growing Chicano civil rights movement, where countless individuals were subjected to police brutal repression, and a few were systematically murdered during public protest conflicts. The barrio was also the arena for self-annihilating, self-hating, deadly gang activity. The poor health conditions of women, children, men, and the elderly could oftentimes be linked to the political and economic forces that resulted in needless pain and death. In many instances, death was not an accident or an act of fate, but was a result of predetermined governmental, corporate, and criminal policies which allowed for high death ratios amongst the Chicano population. So Gamboa's words, they're as an artist of that time, but then also as continuing in the aesthetic traditions, was pointing to the social conditions that really motivated many of the artists to try to reestablish a sense of community, a sense of solidarities, given the many harms that they were experiencing. And it further on to said that they feared that, quote, they feared within such an Anglo atmosphere, young Chicanos would not only soon forget their cultural values, but would also develop a negative sense of their heritage and of themselves in light of the Anglo social cultural practices and values being taught in the public school system and disseminated by the popular media, end quote. So these were some of the contexts by which we see Day of the Dead celebrations being taken up in the United States publicly. So the plan was only to have this for 1 year. They did not expect to continue growing and continue to uphold the celebrations or the practices. The first one being in 1973, they're having their next one in about a week. So that's about 50 years that they've been doing this. Now, the 1973 event helped to develop a greater sense of belonging and community in East LA that honored Mexican and Chicanx cultures. And in doing so, the community participated in quote, collaborative projects which promoted both artistic participation and community empowerment. And in doing so, to shed light on how community production of art affects a sense of neighborhood, ownership, citizen, and a capacity to be agents of change, end quote. So pointing to another example, and another example here, of remembrance of Day of the Dead celebrations. On November 1st of 1998, 25 years after the first public Day of the Dead event, hundreds gathered in procession at the Self-Help Graphics Art Studio from Evergreen Cemetery to Cinco Puntos, which is five corners. It's a very significant intersection in Boyle Heights. That's also where the Chicano moratorium, the memorial was held, and the moratorium began in 1969. It's also a staple of a really good Mexican taco restaurant. Mm-hmm. And so signs held up at the procession testified against the killings of 45 Totosil men and women in Acateal, Chiapas. The signs stating, "Cuántos más masacres?" How many more massacres? And other signs that said, "Vivan los muertos." May the dead live. So Mexicans and Chicanx were, so in the East LA community, they were speaking to transnational injustices that permitted a state-endorsed massacre against indigenous communities in Chiapas. And this public pro-indigenous protests denounced violence that took place across national borders in Mexico. So in these very localized spaces, also ways in which they're identifying solidarities across borders and attending to denouncing and bringing attention to the types of violences that occur for the most marginalized. So pointing to how the altars are operating, we can see that there's a couple ways, at least, the altars are expressing types of relationality. So a relationship with the dead that is reciprocal, treating the dead as part of community, providing sustenance to dead ancestors. This dynamic is not informed by the dichotomy that separates the living and the dead. and or a relationship with the living, those altered. So just pointing attention to the othering process there, the altered. To counter the social processes of invisibilization and affirm the communal solidarities. So that, as I'm seeing that take place in the self-help graphic celebrations and the ways in which the Chicanx communities are identifying altars as a aesthetic and a medium to maintain relationality and connectivity. So what offerings are meant to do is honor the dead, or assert relationality and asserting relationality with them. And so they can enact an aesthetic social resistance by engaging complex and pure, embodied spiritual activities that demand constant attention and recreation. So just some points to thinking about altar offerings, the interconnected relationality, that reciprocity, the solidarities across borders, drawing attention, and bringing visibility, and seeking redress. And I chose this poem here because I think it's helpful to think about the type of relationality that I see the altars invoking or provoking as well. An offering, or the poem is called Offering by Gloria Enedina Alvarez. An offering of starbursts releases us to receive each other from ourselves, to know it is the spirit which draws us near, the embrace of the infinity that pulls and pulses in each of us, the flame, an endless flight. And there's the Spanish translation on the side there. That this is the way her poem is set up, and so I wanted to make sure I keep that as well. Her altar offering practice describes the reciprocal relationship in which we are released to receive each other for ourselves, to know that it is a spirit, right? The sensuous gestures and enacted or taken up in the offering maintain a repetitive activity in which the pull and pulses call the altarist to care for the altar. And the altar, as it also hosts the dead. So that relationship. It's an evocative, aesthetic process that demands a continuous return. It's an interconnected relation, an embodied practice, and it recreates and restructures social organization. This is to say that the altar processes work repeatedly to enact social change and relations. And to conceptualize the Chicana altar practices, aesthetic practices as a resistant communal practice, engaged through repetitive movements and communing with the dead. I suggest that we do see the altar practices as aesthetic rituals or practices of resistance. So theorizing altar making as an aesthetic practice of resistance allows me to return to two fundamental dimensions of the aesthetic activity. One, the altar of space as a site that mediates seemingly contradictory elements. And two, the reciprocal communal relation. The first aspect involves that ephemeral third space I mentioned earlier. It disrupts the separations between the living and the dead, the material, immaterial, public, private, individual, communal. Amalia Mesa-Bains' altar spaces, we see her challenging those types of dichotomies in the innovative aesthetic that bridges domestic space and public space. Maria Chavez Daza asserts the objects and display on the altar disrupt the traditionally conceived private and institutionalized practices of the home. And the altars open a space for anyone to participate in and add to it, thereby creating community on the altar as well. In doing so, the altar engages in embodied activity where the altarist and others build community without collapsing into a singular entity. So, to say this differently, the altar holds this mitigating space in which difference can be upheld without being reduced to sameness, thereby generating a non-hierarchical social practice. The second dimension of the altar of resistance is, of course, the communal relations. And so how the social can be reconfigured, reorganized to match or along with the sensibilities of the group. So altar making cultivates a sensibility that reemerges through the enactments of the offering to the dead. The offerings are co-relational processes that are informed by the dead and the ways in which the living are seeking to maintain community with them. Honoring these relations requires attention, care, and reciprocity. But they're not processes that are orientated towards completion or an end, right? They're continuous and they may require returning to. The relations are sustained through repetitive motion, continuously to engage resistance from within the living's situatedness. So thinking back to the self-help graphics Day of the Dead, in which the communities are erecting the altars informed by their concrete circumstances and the everyday social conditions that they're embedded in. The altars are a site in which their communion between, amongst themselves, the living and the living, but then also between the living and the dead, can establish connectivity and reciprocity as aesthetic resistance that sustains the spirits of the altar. So the shared sensibility here, the reciprocal, the communal are very significant to how these altar practices are taken up in the Chicanx aesthetics. So I'm pointing us now to an altar that was up at Plaza de la Raza in Lincoln Heights. This was last year. And thinking to the ways in which the earlier altars were confronting state-sanctioned violence and intracommunal harms, this altar is publicly erected and directed towards the types of violences that women are experiencing in Juarez, Ciudad Juarez, just across the border of Texas and El Paso. So in 2021, I witnessed this aesthetic practice at the altar site in Lincoln Heights. And this altar is not necessarily or singularly based on familial relationality. It's with and for all the women who have been murdered or disappeared in Mexico. And the offerings to the victims of feminicide articulates a relationality that is based on solidarity, recognition, and calls to justice. And so here it says, dedicated to the murdered women of Juarez, especially to the artist and activist Isabel Cabanillas de la Torre, who was murdered last year in Juarez, Mexico. And then the translation just below. And so alongside you see the border of the marigolds, and you see this throughout. See like a drawer, a desk drawer with marigolds inside, high heels, like shoes, more flowers, and then the arch and the image up here. Marigolds are the flower in many indigenous communities and actually in many traditions, but as Chicanx peoples are taking it up. The flower is like a flower of the dead also is called, that it has a very potent scent. And as you can smell that, it's meant to help guide the dead to the altar and through the thresholds. There. Asserting relationality through the altar recognizes the harms committed against a targeted population and brings attention to the high rates of disappearances and murders that go unsolved. While the altar on a macro level does not dissolve the systems in place that continuously perpetuate the violence against women of the area, it holds a space to reflect, to seek redress, and to honor those who have been killed, while challenging the institutional neglect by Mexican and U.S. officials. In a similar way, another altar was raised to honor people who have been killed through or through state-sanctioned violence. This altar covered an entire wall and extended out a bit. This was the similar location of the museum, but the items were placed for activists, including Victor Jara, a Chilean teacher killed during the Pinochet dictatorship, Oscar Romero, a Catholic priest assassinated in El Salvador for speaking out against government violence, Las Hermanas Mirabel, three sisters who spoke out against the Trujillo regime, but were later assassinated. So here's some closer images where you can see some of the people that I've mentioned. You also have Che Guevara, Zapatista Comandante, and Huey P. Newton, Zapata, Day of the Dead bread, pan de muerto, apples, of course, to offer sustenance and delicious food to your dead. Now, these are not familial relations that are being enacted. They're not based on, was it my aunt, my uncle, my dad? There's a different relationality happening here. The altars invoke the revolutionary spirits of these people who contested the everyday systematized violence that targeted marginalized peoples. These altars act as conduits of a revitalizing social aesthetic that involves histories of subversion and practices of community making. And in doing so, they cultivate spiritual spaces, resistance spaces that sustain relations and promote an open creativity in which local spaces are represented by those of the community and of their expansive concerns. The transformation of the altars were made possible by community participation and community offerings to the dead, right? The dead are front and center here. These are aesthetic rituals of resistance, of practices of resistance. And we can see that the altars maintain these spaces that strengthen communal relations and promote social transformation. The open communal resistance of the altar making in this instance illustrates the sensibility of the Rasquache Domesticana. That is an openness to the space being within the community, and enacting and maintaining a non-hierarchical disposition, imagining a space, imagining a relationality, enacting a relationality that does not hold the living above the dead, that does not separate indigenous, Black, Catholic peoples necessarily by those identities alone. Repeating the altar process annually brings forth social relations that sustain communal resistance, grounded in complex relations between the living and the dead. Altar practices, altar making, altar makers, they act as conduits to hold together the communities, the multiple communities. And so these are not homogeneous communities, right? They're not reducible to singularized identities or singularized traditions and knowledges. They're multiple communities, multiple knowledges coexisting. Yes, tensions exist. Yes, difference exists. But they're held together at these altar spaces, and offerings are placed to honor these spirits, the dead, and maintain relations not only with the dead, but also among the living. And in doing so, as I've tried to contend here, I think that they bolster resistance to dominant social norms. Thank you. Oh, actually, let me say one last thing. This is the altar that was co-created this year by myself and some lovely folks at Texas A&M. This is an altar that includes some of my family members, some of my husband's family members, some of my friends' family members, colleagues' family members. Also, what I often do is I add Gloria Ansaldúa and Maria Lugones, who have passed away, to my altar practice. And what you have here are offerings, so like flaming hot chips, oranges, bananas, apples. My dad loved jalapenos, so I included some up there for him. You have water. You have flowers, papel picado. Papel picado and the flowers are reiterating that like ephemeral dimension. They're not permanent. They're meant to only be short-lived, right? So this was a co-created altar. Many people who contributed early on did not understand what it would mean to honor their dead in this way. And it was a very powerful experience because many people, I think it overtook them, that doing something for someone that's passed, offering for them, right? It was for them, prioritizing their needs and their desires could grab such a hold on them in this present, like embodied experience. And so I just wanted to share that with you all because I think there are many ways in which altars are doing a lot of beautiful work in community. And so the resisting of the life and dead dichotomy is very much so a part of how that altar construction took place. So that's my final thing there.
Well, thank you, Denise. So we'll have questions from the audience, and I'll try, if there are questions from the chat on YouTube, I'll try to ask them too. But Andrew.
Thank you, Denise. This is fantastic. But actually, this slide is perfect for like the things I hope you'll elaborate on. Just specify where this installation is that this altar you co-created.
It was at my home.
Okay, so this is in your home. Whereas you were showing us other stuff that's more public, either in a gallery or out. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like the appearance of this public altars was a rather new phenomenon, 1970s-ish, which is, so I guess I'm interested in hearing you elaborate more on the dynamic between, and forgive the binaries, but like, so artists and activists are in a sense, well, they're part of the intelligentsia, right? And then, but it sounds like the Rasquache movement and all these, they saw themselves as drawing on domestic grassroots kind of sensibilities, and they're giving a name to it and then putting it into a gallery space, for instance. So you showed us a photo of like an installation, right, a domestic altar that was in a gallery, right? So, so it looks like what we've done is we've taken a private thing, we put it out in the public to some degree, and we start thinking about it. We, the elites and the activists, are thinking about it, and then maybe it becomes communal, and that's where I guess I would like to go with it. Are you tracking at all kind of the other direction? Like once you, and part of what I'm thinking too is like the visibility of the dead, like the Coco, right? Those kinds of all of a sudden it's like they're in the popular imagination, highly visible. And are you seeing both with these altars in particular, but then also these other public expressions, are you seeing that have any kind of effect on the domestic ways way people configure these, think about them, and so forth and so on? Hopefully you can kind of understand the dynamics I'm interested in.
Yeah. So almost, if I'm sort of paraphrasing, I think you're alluding to like, well, this also still seems like, yes, it's this public space, but then like museums and how are we accessing that? And then going into my home altar and like who can even access my home and who can come into my home and participate in some of this. Yeah, so in the private public sort of dichotomy, how that's operating in the various altars that I've put out. Yeah, so Amalia Mesa-Bains' altars do intentionally bring forward the audience to try to bring in that engagement with the altar itself. So in one sense, the public is very much so involved in that creation, as it's not meant to be treated as a dead space. So there's ways in which she sets that up, and it's a little less obvious in these. There's another installation where she also has like a mirror, and so you have to gaze into the mirror, and then in the mirror is Coatlique, a deity of Aztec cosmology. And so you're bringing yourself into some of these altar installations. And so there's that way in which she's trying to, of course, maintain that the public is interacting, and so there's not this rigid boundary in place. With that said, just a little bit of the trajectory that you were touching on. Yeah, when I first started doing the public practices, my mom said, we never used to do this. We would go to the cemetery and we would honor our dead at the cemetery. That's where we would hold our altar. Also, like, we'd have the altar in our home, not taking it out and showing everyone. And so certainly this wasn't something that was necessarily practiced by large, the Day of the Dead celebrations that we're referring to now. And that's why I think it is part of my intervention to say, we have all of these big Day of the Dead celebrations that we're all trying to do now across the United States. But the public Day of the Dead celebrations that we talk about, and the ones in Coco, are not necessarily the same lineages, not necessarily the same trajectories. Now, that's not to say they're separate. You know, the Chicano artists of the early 1970s, Carlos Bueno, he was a Mexican immigrant. And so what we know, of course, and especially the academics, we all know, people are crossing borders. And what that means, especially because of the proximity of the US and Mexico, ideas, practices, they're continuously taken up in very localized ways. And so he was one of those persons that did, the artist, that did think it is important for us to think about how as communities we connect these seemingly intimate, private practices and displays of relationality with the dead and building community in a public way. They were much smaller then, so even what we're talking about is who the public is, the audience, and how the public grows. Now the self-help graphics altar or Day of the Dead celebrations are massive, thousands of people. So certainly there's the ways in which these trajectories are not reducible to singular starting points or origins or genesis. With that said, they're communal. They're communal celebrations, they're communal practices. The altars are created communally. Yes, as an artist is involved, but then as also a community is involved in that co-creation. And so I do hesitate with grouping all artists as belonging to like this elite social status, especially given that Chicano artists in the 1970s their art wasn't even recognized as art. It was very much so pushed against as like folk practices of sorts. And so being with the Rasquache being of the community, within the community, is also attentive to that. And they take up many debates at the time. Ybarra-Frausto and Mesa-Bains pushing against misconceptions of their art, even being something as like kitsch, right? And they're saying, no, this is something ostensibly that's within the community, articulated from within the community as a way in which we're enacting, subverting meanings and also enacting or generative relationality. And so it pushes against the very nice categories that might exist between, you know, the artist and the community, the individual and the community, or even the public and the private. Yeah. Does that get to what you were wondering?
I was inviting Denise once, so I also want other people to join us.
Okay.
It was a wonderful presentation, particularly the poem, I think, in Espanol. I'm sending my students to Latinx in Brooklyn, Fifth Avenue, very large American community, and you know, for the Day of the Dead, for them to see what is there. I don't think you can Ciudad de Mexico for the Dia de los Muertos, and I'm assuming that I will see there because of the political
Mm.
stuff that's going on now, some versions of what we were talking about. The other question, I do have a question, a suggestion. I do a lot of photography on vernacular landscape, and so that's my way of appropriating people. Have you looked at kind of a cross-cultural way of looking at these cultures which are similar in some ways to Italian American stuff and Italian stuff and Asian stuff, and particularly Japanese cultures, etc. And then my last thing, you know, given what's going on in LA now, are you thinking about, is anybody thinking about using this, the Day of the Dead to bring people together in LA because they share some of the disgraceful incidents in that city? Might be a way of bringing them together.
Would you mind specifying a little bit of what you're thinking about, like the disgraceful?
I'm hoping, because of what's going on in LA now, all of a sudden, politicians fighting.
Oh, I see. Uh-huh.
You know, I'm kind of forgetting how they're in the same boat in so many ways in LA. That maybe some kind of bringing together of the thing that you shared, of all of the victims, maybe it would be a way of bringing some value out of it. You don't have to answer any of my questions.
I'll go with that one first, just because I have the shortest answer for that, I think, at least. I don't know yet. I do plan on going back, and I would not be surprised if that is the case. I know there are a lot of protest calls for resigning, given the anti-Black and anti-Indigenous efforts, right? Like more than just language, like efforts they were scheming by Los Angeles politicians. So I can always report back, because I do plan on going this time around, and I can of course pay extra attention to how that's being taken up, because certainly many communities, including the communities that I've been talking about, are denouncing that and calling for the resignation. The Day of the Dead celebrations in Brooklyn here, I did not actually know much about that. Dr. Campos has mentioned that there's growing events and celebrations that are taking place locally, and so I'm glad to hear that, and I'll have to look into that further. I am also envious that you get to go to Mexico City to check that out, because that's a goal. So part of the histories of Day of the Dead celebrations in the US are also influenced by a lot of the ways in which Mexican artists were taking up death as, like, in the icons and their imagery to, like, criticize. So for example, Jose Guadalupe Posada being one of those persons, right? A journalist, a social political critique to the ways in which the middle class and the elite were in their everyday. But I think that, again, goes back to some of these trans-border influences and interactions. I'm curious how it might look in the near future, the influences in Mexico City, given how many people in the U.S. that were raised in the U.S. but not born in the U.S. are deported to Mexico and are building communities in Mexico, and Mexico City being one of the larger ones also, given like call centers and industries that are available to them. With that being said, I'm curious if any of these practices are taken up in ways that their influence is involved there. And to your last question about the other communities that I've been examining, or that I can examine to further identify some of these connections. I have not done a substantial amount of research to speak cohesively about that. I have learned a little bit about so other Asian traditions, like in Indian practices, in Chinese practices, and so the ways in which the relationality with the dead is taken up. And I see that as important to how I am pointing out that the dominant norms of separating the living and the dead are not all upheld in many other spaces as well. And so I think that is something that I also need to further examine.
That was wonderful. I really enjoyed all of it. I have two questions. One kind of clarification. The other one's a little antagonistic, which I think will just help you give you the opportunity to think through further, kind of the point you're trying to make. The first one is you keep mentioning resistance without the suppressed premise in the talk. Resisting what? How is it resisting? Especially with things, you consider things like simulacra or the recuperation of Theos Marcos into capital culture. That oftentimes defangs radical movements in a lot of ways. Think about punk, think about hip hop in the early 90s. Once it becomes recuperated and becomes a commodity, it loses its resistatory force, and this is how the spiraling cadaver of capital progresses. So that's kind of the first question. So what do you mean by resistance? The second question, kind of jumping a little bit up to the gentleman's point about Confucianism, because it gives you a good alternative to think about the same problem, but from a completely different cultural standpoint. And so here's where it gets a little bit of a pushback against you. But ancestor worship there is used as a traditional or regressive way of perpetuating norms of how subjects are interpolated that actually prevents kind of revolutionary radical forms of thinking. So in many ways, ancestor worship is used as a basin in Confucianism for conservatism. Because I have to worship the ancestors, it then predicates regressively backwards on me what I can and can't do with my own life. So I have to act certain ways to, so in a way your ancestors end up becoming this ghost, kind of spectral ontology or something that then polices my activities in life, that then actually limits me. And so that kind of also goes to the idea of, you talk about repetition, and for Deleuze, repetition is actually what kills. The repetition of identities is actually what prevents the play of newness from arising. So those kind of 2 points. Number one, resisting how, and number two, is it not kind of conservative and actually anti-revolutionary? It was amazing once again.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. Very thought-provoking. I'm thinking over here which one to start with. Okay, so thinking about the first one with resistance. Yeah, so resistance to what? In the aesthetic traditions that I'm referencing, and I'll just point just a little bit to the quote with Gara. In the aesthetic tradition that I'm referencing, it's these hierarchies of what, and exclusionary hierarchies essentially, right? Like what would be considered even art in and of itself? What are these knowledges, these histories, and these traditions that are considered valuable, that are considered knowledge even of themselves, right? And so there's an erasure, a flattening, a suppression of the knowledges that are produced in these traditions and by these cultures. And so in the aesthetic traditions, we can see how that is also pointing to the ways in which outside of the aesthetic norms that are upheld, that they're tied to these institutional practices that we also see in society. So this type of exclusion we can see in the aesthetic traditions. Another point of the exclusions that exist and the resistance that's taking place, and I point to in the Chicano movement, is the ways in which we could see this happening in like the classroom setting. The classroom setting of what, again, going back with the knowledge production, like what is knowledge, what is considered knowledge, those are not considered knowledge. And so we can see how, just threading through a little bit in that context, these are practices that are promoted through colonial modern systems of power. And so we, in this context of like Spain and now Mexico, we can see how this suppression took place in like literally burning and removing codices of from people there, and the separation of the type of cosmologies or suppression of the cosmologies in the communities that existed. But as we're seeing it with the Chicanx peoples, and then as they are in identifying themselves in part of these lineages in the United States, there's a double colonization that they're saying they're protesting against. And so it's of that from Spanish colonial Mexico, but then also in the United States. And so in the United States, that type of oppressions that have very material harms, and not only in, let's say, in art and in the educational setting, but like in the social settings, where the high numbers of Mexican Americans that were being killed in the Vietnam War was that which where they were protesting, like life. The fact that their lives were not valued, right? And so resisting those types of harms, and also as they've been internalized, and we can see in the types of like gang violence that existed, or even the drug use that was taken up, were ways in which community making became even more vital, because lives are being taken and knowledges are being suppressed and beliefs are being neglected. And so in various levels, on various levels, and through different ways in which it's being addressed or challenged. Chicanx peoples were using art and altar practices to be able to identify the harms that they were experiencing and reassert a type of relationality that did not conform to the colonial modern logics that meant to separate individuals and communities, that meant to separate material from immaterial, as well as the living and the dead. And so there were various ways in which that resistance is taken up, like even on the levels of those dichotomies in the altar practices, but then on the very material ways in which we can see those systems of power are harming the communities. If that got to what your question is. And I'll quickly get to, just to point out with the Confucianist point, yeah, I think I want to be very careful to say this is the formula for resistance across the board. I think I appreciate you bringing up a different tradition in which these practices don't equate to the type of resistance that I'm trying to say exists in these practices. And so I have to, I'm not a Confucian scholar, I will admit, so I do have to look at what the practices look like and how that ends up, as you were saying, reasserting a type of hierarchy that is problematic in that it closes possibilities for change or invention.
May I suggest one more question?
Sure, go ahead. I mean, if there's no time, that's fine.
Oh, I think you can ask it in 1 minute.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to say thank you for reminding me about the resistance component of something that we laughed at, right? That was the tradition, right? That people felt. So it wasn't uncommon for us to have the altar and for my grandmother to do mole and put the Coca-Cola and put my grandfather's picture. And we all came together as a family, we prayed, we ate bread, and we went along with it. But when I came to the United States, it became a symbol of, like you said, people looking down on those practices as witchcraft, right? So I remember as in elementary school telling me, when they talked to us about Day of the Dead, they said, oh, it's brujeria, right? And then kind of reaffirming my identity in high school when we were talking about the Chicano movement and civil rights and looking at that, saying, well, that's part of my culture and I should feel proud of it. Re-owning my identity as part of this, resistance. And, the altar symbolizing the indigenous people fighting against the church, saying, we're going to follow your rules, but we're going to play our symbols in the altars, right? So I just wanted to say that thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, two final things before we finished and thank her. First, thank you to the New Media Center at the library for live streaming and helping us get this talk to people throughout the United States. You're welcome to our reception at 3308 Boylan, the philosophy department, where we can talk more with Denise and other people at the department. So please come if you have a chance. And let's thank Denise for a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hopefully we get more chance to talk. I know there are Oh, okay. Um, yes, thank you so much for that question. And, you know, it certainly also made me think of, so in Mexico, when you were sharing just now, in Mexico, there is this big governmental effort to evade the projection of Halloween onto the adult population because that would be like just a position like that would not be of Mexico. That would be the U.S. sort of. So when you were saying that just now, I thought, yeah, that's right.